For the ocean, Mr. Peter Thomson.
Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all courtesy is observed and greetings to everyone convened here with us for the 14th World Ocean Forum 2020. Whatever your circumstances in these trying times, I hope that you and your families are safe and well. The Ocean Forum is taking place in Busan in Korea and is being joined by those of us in virtual attendance from around the world. We've gathered together to discuss the forum's theme of one more step towards the sustainable future of the ocean. And I take this opportunity to thank the forum's organizers for giving me the privilege of speaking to you today on this subject so dear to my heart. To jolt our thinking today, I'm going to open my remarks by saying something that might seem a bit blunt. This is that a major global pandemic has been coming at us for some time now, and that we were duly warned. For at least 2 decades now, global health authorities had been alerting us to the fact that the world was overdue for the next big viral pandemic, with particular emphasis on the dangers arising from intense juxtaposition of pigs and poultry and humans, and the perils of zoonotic diseases developing out of widely degrading natural habitats. We were warned, and here in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, most governments would relish a means to turn back the clock in order to better heed those warnings and more stringently impose the protocols prepared for looming pandemic. I make this point because there are many other pertinent global warnings based on the consensus of the best of our scientific authorities, to which many blithely or fatalistically turn a blind eye. I refer you in particular to the major reports coming out of IPCC and IPBES in recent years, warning of the potentially disastrous course of the climate crisis and the rapid dwindling of biodiversity. These led the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in his address to the Blue COP in Madrid last December to say that we are knowingly destroying the life support systems of our planet. On the basis of our COVID-19 experience, the question has to be asked of these alerts: are we doing enough to mitigate and adapt? One of the key lessons of the COVID pandemic is that we are dependent upon balance between each other and with the natural world. Thus, not even the exigencies of the pandemic are justification for eroding the meager protections and actions that we have in place to create that balance. In that regard, existing and nascent measures of conservation, such as marine protected areas, must be sacrosanct. And we have to create more ambitious standards for our relationship with nature, such as protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. And we must now apply the best of our innovative solutions, resources, and will in the direction of the blue-green recovery road that lies ahead. I'll say more on that subject in my remarks to you today. But to finish this opening salvo, I'd like to emphasize that if we're to have a future in harmony with what remains of the natural world, we've arrived at the decade in which we're required to transform our patterns of consumption and production and habitat destruction, or suffer the bitter consequences. We must end the plague of plastic pollution of the ocean, of discarded fishing gear, of illegal and damaging fishing practices, and we must stop the alteration of the temperature and chemical composition of the ocean with our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions before it's too late. No healthy planet without a healthy ocean. Thus, for our collective well-being, we must face up to the realities of our time and make the required transformations. The word crisis comes from the Greek word krisis, meaning time of decision. And if there ever was one such, this is the time for making major decisions. Decisions that will directly affect the quality of life of our children and grandchildren in the remaining years of this century. The self-interest of our species demands that when we get to the Glasgow Climate COP in November next year, that we're ready to decide to make the unprecedented reductions required of our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Between now and then, Every platform touching on this subject needs to hear that message loud and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to address you on the subject of a sustainable ocean economy, or as others describe it, the sustainable blue economy. To do so, I'll draw heavily on the findings of recent reports of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. The high-level panel is made up of 14 heads of government, co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Norway and the President of Palau, and I have the honor of serving as a supporting member of the panel in my special envoy capacity. The high-level panel has released a series of reports, each prepared by world experts in their respective fields. One of these reports is The Ocean as a Solution for Climate Change, which clearly demonstrates that full implementation of 5 ocean-based climate solutions could deliver 1/5 of the annual greenhouse gas emission cuts the world needs by 2050 to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Another shows that for every dollar invested in select areas of the sustainable blue economy, such as offshore wind power, there's a $5 return. Another of the high-level panel's reports, entitled A Sustainable and Equitable Blue Recovery to the COVID-19 Crisis, concludes that policymakers and financial decision-makers must enhance the ocean economy's role in their social and recovery plans and ensure that the ocean economy rebuilds to be more sustainable, equitable, and resilient. It demonstrates that the ocean economy, which contributes upwards of $1.5 trillion in value added to the global economy, has been particularly hard hit by the pandemic, with massive revenue losses felt across coastal and marine tourism, fisheries and aquaculture, and the global shipping industry. Hundreds of millions of jobs have been affected, with disproportionate impacts for developing and small island nations and already vulnerable coastal communities. Inseparable links between ocean-based and land-based economies means that a sustainable and equitable recovery is critical, not just for those who live or work near the coasts, but for the well-being and resilience of societies and economies at large. But despite the significance of the impacts, this report shows that only a limited number of investments through stimulus and recovery packages are currently directed towards affected ocean workers, coastal communities, and the sustainable rebuilding of the ocean economy. This has to change, for reinforcement of old bad habits is no cure for the ailments we have brought upon people and planet. This is why the blue-green recovery road is the right way for us to go. The trillions of dollars now being earmarked for recovery and stimulus packages are a crucial lever for shifting from those old ways to a more sustainable route that delivers on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and brings us to a carbon-neutral world by 2050. In linking with this thinking, the high-level panel's report proposes 5 priority opportunities for immediate investment of stimulus funds to support a sustainable and equitable blue recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Invest in coastal and marine ecosystem restoration and protection. Invest in sewerage and wastewater infrastructure for coastal communities. Invest in sustainable community-led, non-fed marine aquaculture, for example, shellfish and seaweed. Incentivize zero-emission marine transport and incentivize sustainable ocean-based renewable energy. Finally, the report clarifies that, as evidenced by the stimulus response to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, not all investments will be directed at measures capable of providing job creation in the short term. Instead, much of the investment will be used to lay the foundation for long-term recovery through systematic transitions to improve the efficiency and cost-effectiveness of the economy, and initiating large infrastructure projects that will yield benefits over the next 10 to 30 years. But the urgency cannot be overstated. As the world continues to battle the pandemic, millions are without incomes to provide for themselves and their families. They need a job and a lifeline for right now and for the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you'll have picked up that one of the report's priority areas was incentivization of zero-emission marine transport. The greening of shipping is a fascinating example of the historical watershed that we are approaching. with close parallels to the time only 100 years ago when the world moved from horse and bullock propulsion to the internal combustion engine. What a joy it will be to witness the end of the era of fossil fuel-powered transportation. What a righteous transformation from the planet-polluting ways through which we have lived and died. It's estimated the greening of ocean-based transport alone will contribute a 1.8% reduction in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions globally. In April 2018, the International Maritime Organization's Marine Environment Protection Committee adopted an initial strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships, setting out a vision to reduce GHG emissions from international shipping and phase them out as soon as possible this century. The strategy includes a specific reference to a pathway of CO2 emissions reduction consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. This laudable vision confirms IMO's commitment to reducing GHG emissions from international shipping as a matter of urgency to phasing them out as soon as possible. In making note of that, I'd like to particularly recognize the sterling efforts of the IMO Secretary General, Kitak Lim, in his steady steering throughout this course. The world already has the technologies and innovations it needs to put ocean-based climate solutions into motion. We're already seeing positive signs of snowballing innovation in everything from food production to waste management, from renewable energy to, yes indeed, greening of shipping. Innovation will see us move from linear exploitation of finite planetary resources into an era of circular economies, sustainable systems and resilient societies. And it will enable us to better safeguard the biodiversity of nature upon which our lives ultimately depend. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to think about the 6 principles that UN Secretary General Guterres laid down in his Earth Day address this year. Principles that include implementation of the clean green transition, ending fossil fuel subsidies, investing public funds into a future of sustainable projects that help the environment and the climate, and my favorite, making polluters pay for their pollution. Paying for your own pollution. What an eminently logical proposition. Where, you might ask, would that place the plastic industry? Plastics have polluted our planet, from mountaintops to ocean trenches. The World Economic Forum and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have estimated that by 2050, there will be at least 937 million tons of plastic in the ocean, compared with 895 million tons of fish. More plastic than fish in the ocean. And it's not just the plastic detritus you see on the beaches or floating in the tide. The profusion of plastic microfibers permeating our marine ecosystems means that when you're eating fish or shellfish, I'm sorry to say that these days you're also eating microplastics. How did we get to this state? I'm old enough to remember a world without plastic, and it was very nice without it, thank you. When you consider what you personally are going to do to assist the world get to carbon neutrality by 2050, I ask you to examine your relationship with plastic. I can only repeat, refuse it where and when you can, reduce your use of it, reuse it, and recycle it. It's abundantly clear that what happens on land has implications for the state of the ocean, and what we do to the ocean has consequences for us on land. This is the basis of the source to sea or ridge to reef ethos. We know that for too long the ocean has been the end recipient for much of the waste and pollution produced on land, and the plague of plastic pollution is at the forefront. According to UN Environment, plastic litter in the Asia-Pacific region alone costs its tourism, fishing, and shipping industries $1.3 billion per annum. In Europe, cleaning plastic wastes from coasts and beaches alone costs about €630 million per year. Studies suggest that the total economic damage to the world's marine ecosystem caused by plastic amounts to at least $13 billion every year. Surely it's time to make the polluter pay. But we should not imagine that winning the battle to end the plastic pollution will be an easy one. The plastic industry is planning and investing for 40% growth over the next decade. Like the tobacco industry before it, the plastic industry is aware of the public's growing dismay and is well prepared for its rebuttal. If governments and consumers want to wise up on what lies ahead for plastic, there's much we can learn from the drawn-out battle with tobacco. Sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a hopefully temporary resurgence of plastic profusion, in spite of the fact that the coronavirus survives longer on hard surfaces like plastic than on soft surfaces like paper. The fight to replace single-use plastics has to face this challenge, for indeed plastic has received a big boost from the pandemic. But pandemics pass, while the climate crisis and the marine plastic pollution crisis will not abate unless we overcome their root causes. I've touched on what is perhaps the least understood aspect of the marine plastic pollution crisis, that of microplastics. We know that everything from our stretchy apparel to the paint that covers our steel ends up as microplastic in the ocean. It now permeates the food chain, from the microfauna that ingest it, up through the trophic levels to the humans that eat fish. They have permeated the food chain. We are eating them. They are crossing our blood-brain barriers. And we have not yet concluded sufficient scientific and medical studies to reach a consensus on what the effects of this mass ingestion of plastic is on human health. This, too, is work to be done. All is not lost on this. There are many great organizations and people around the world working in pursuit of solutions to the marine plastic pollution problem. I'd like to make special mention of GPAP, the Global Plastic Action Partnership, whose members include the likes of the Coca-Cola Company and Nestle, and whose expert advisors include organizations like the World Bank and UNEP. GPAP aims to show how businesses, communities, and governments can redesign the global take, make, dispose economy into a circular one in which products and materials are redesigned and recovered and reused to reduce environmental impacts. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you read the freely available Breaking the Plastic Wave report, recently released by Pew Charitable Trusts and a group of high expertise collaborators. The report concludes, the time is now to act on plastic pollution, for an implementation delay of 5 years will result in an additional 80 million metric tons of plastic going into the ocean by 2040. If we want to significantly reduce plastic leakage, the report makes it clear that we have the solutions at our fingertips with all the elements of a system change already existing today, under development and or near adoption. They show that the next 2 years are pivotal if key milestones are to be achieved by 2025, including halting the production of avoidable plastic, incentivizing consumers around reuse, improving labeling, and testing innovations such as new delivery models. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to say something on the state of fisheries, and I'm glad to do so as my special envoy role gives me responsibility to ensure SDG 14, the UN goal that calls for the conservation and sustainable use of ocean resources, is being implemented. One of SDG 14's targets, SDG 14.4, requires us by 2020 to effectively regulate harvesting and end overfishing, illegal and destructive fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans in order to restore fish stocks in the shortest time possible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. These are not hollow words. They were consensually agreed to by the leaders of every member state of the United Nations back in 2015, and our job is to faithfully implement them. Best estimates show that about 1 in 5 fish globally, representing an annual value of around $20 billion, is illegally caught. In the coastal waters of developing countries, it's estimated that 1 in every 3 fish caught falls under the category of IUU fishing. This fact seriously impacts management efforts and the food security of local populations who depend on fish as their main source of protein. You could say that ending illegal fishing is akin to stopping crime, and even the most optimistic amongst us would find that a tall order in the short term. But that should not stop our best efforts to do so. It should be noted that the indicator set by the UN for judging progress towards this target is relatively straightforward, pointing us to the proportion of global fish stocks being harvested within biologically sustainable levels. With determination from all relevant quarters, that is a winnable proposition. In FAO's recently launched 2020 SOFIA report, we see the proportion of fish stocks harvested within biologically sustainable levels decreased from 90% in 1974 to 65.8% in 2017. Take this together with SOFIA's report that fish caught at biologically unsustainable levels, i.e. overfished, now sits at a level of 34.2%, and that 35% of the global fishing harvest is lost or wasted, and we cannot be satisfied with our performance to date. So what does that mean for us all? It means we try harder, supporting the good advances like the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration, strengthening support for regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs, particularly those ones that need help, and doubling down on the ratification and implementation of FAO's Port State Measures Agreement. For those of you interested in the fisheries industry, I recommend you take a good look at the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration that the Global Tuna Alliance has formulated. Fully implemented, the declaration's principles will deliver us a tuna supply chain that is legal, sustainable, and transparent. I applaud the fact that it gives effective commitments to support RFMO and government regulation and monitoring of fishing efforts and catches. Highly important is its commitment to effective traceability so that consumers know where their tuna has come from. As I often say, as a regular consumer of fish, I want the assurance from retailers and restaurants that I'm not a receiver of stolen goods. And yes, we must all call for and work alongside government action to ensure all aspects of tuna fishing and processing are safe and free from human rights abuses and/or modern slavery. In pursuit of best practices of fisheries management, RFMOs are a vital cog in our movement towards sustainable use of the ocean's resources. We have now got most of the fisheries management knowledge and experience required to reverse the long disappointing trends on overfishing. FAO has found that where fisheries are intensively managed, stocks are consistently above target levels or are rebuilding. FAO has also determined that where political will for prioritizing sustainable fisheries management is present, and there is meaningful involvement of local communities in ecosystem management efforts, the tide can be turned on threatened marine resources, rebuilding of the depleted stocks, and restoration of degraded habitats. FAO is adamant that management is the best form of conservation. That's why we're heavily dependent on proper functioning of the RFMOs to achieve our goal of sustainability. From all these facts, it's not unreasonable to find reason for optimism. Do the right things with the required level of effort, and we can indeed achieve SDG 14.4 in due course. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, it is true that 2020 super year has been disrupted and that most of our key conferences have been postponed. But no more than that. The conferences will be held as soon as the conditions allow, and we will gather at them in real and virtual format to deliberate, for we remain resolutely committed to the multilateral process aimed at securing a sustainable way of life on this planet. In the meantime, we have a responsibility to maintain the momentum and, where required, use our best endeavors to meet the targets set by international agreement. As I'm sure you know, the United Nations General Assembly has mandated the holding of the next UN Ocean Conference to be held in Lisbon and to be co-hosted by the governments of Kenya and Portugal. Because of the pandemic, the conference has been postponed until 2021, with confirmed dates to be announced once the course of the COVID pandemic is clearer. In the meantime, step-by-step preparations for the conference are proceeding, and there are many things about it which are already certain. The first is that fisheries will be a major element of consideration. This is so because Sustainable Development Goal 14 contains 4 crucial targets that mature in 2020, one of which is SDG 14.4, setting out to effectively regulate harvesting and end overfishing. Another is that science, innovation, partnerships, and solutions will be infused into the work of the conference. This is guaranteed because the UN member states, in their wisdom, decided as such in designating the conference theme. A third is the fact that the co-hosts are determined to oversee a conference that will emulate its 2017 predecessor by being a global game changer for ocean action, all in support of SDG 14's successful implementation. In Lisbon, we will put out more sail, that we may be best equipped for the rigors, the full discovery, and the new understandings of the decade-long voyage that lies before us. So I hope to meet you all in Lisbon next year, and I thank you for your kind attention to my words.